You are not. Oh, I thought you were in front of like the stadium at Notre Dame or something in your Zoom, but I'm happy to see that's not the case. You're not even listening to talking.
Wow, I'm on YouTube. It's the first time ever.
Congratulations.
Meeting is now streaming on YouTube.
Hey, don't.
Okay.
I'll put it on Facebook.
Someone want to put it in Slack, although who is even in Slack anymore?
Slack is dead.
All right. Can
Slack's
y'all hear
dead.
me?
You still should post it in Slack though.
I did.
Can you hear my mic?
Yeah, we can hear your.
Sweet. Very good.
You guys. So I hope that you guys feel prepared because usually I feel like a little prepared and I like didn't even look at my own questions this week. So
I told that to Kevin about like 20 minutes ago.
that you weren't prepared.
Like, I don't even know what the topic is tonight, KG.
I seriously thought about talking to, like, I thought about bringing it up when we talked on the phone today, Dan, and then I was like, he'll be fine. He saw all of our text messages that we sent literally for 3 hours this morning. So
he'll be fine.
All right. Well, usually I feel like a little prepared and I like didn't even look at my. Why is this echoing?
I hear you. Echo.
Can you guys hear me? That's
somebody has their audio on.
Shouldn't have echoed like that though.
Okay, guys.
Can't see it on YouTube.
How about a quick Insta? Everybody like wave. Just be like, hey.
Is that for Instagram?
No, it's fun. I'm gonna do
this. This is an interesting start.
It was for Instagram. All right.
For the gram.
You guys, what'd you guys do this weekend?
Martin and I.
We started mass this weekend. Sorry, Sam, go ahead.
Oh no, that's the most important thing and the biggest thing.
That we had mass this weekend.
Yeah.
Exciting stuff.
What else did you guys do this weekend?
I went and saw my nephew on Friday and Saturday.
Fun.
He's doing it well. He's super cute.
He is super cute. He has a lot of hair.
Yeah. He's already had 2 haircuts and he's 9 months old. Crazy.
That's awesome. Cool. What about you, Martin?
I was at a socially distanced gathering of sorts.
For the whole weekend?
Pretty much, yeah. Pretty much the whole weekend.
For the whole weekend? Wow. That's a pretty intense
Well, I went to 3
gathering.
different distanced gatherings.
You what?
I went to 3 different ones.
Wow.
Mr. Popular.
Mr. Popular.
I saw 2 of the people on this call.
I don't know what you're talking about.
3 of the people on this call, actually.
It wasn't me.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. I was socially distancing the whole weekend, so.
I haven't seen anyone in 3 months.
You know, I kind of believe that that's true, Sam. It's not true. I'm just kidding. All right, so.
He thinks it's true.
Sam thinks it's true. All right. So last week was dating. Do you guys have any like reflections on last week?
Hey, we
Jenny,
can
if you go
start
back and like
before we go farther.
Whoa.
We should start in prayer. Who wants to pray? See, that's what the seminarians are here for. That's great. Thanks, Kev. You did your job.
First time I've remembered to do it. So I guess I'll do it since I thought of it.
That's great.
Right.
You should.
Yeah. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy
Spirit. Amen.
Lord, we thank you for gathering us here. We thank you for giving us this day more moments to grow in knowledge of you and knowledge and love of you. We ask you to guide our conversation, to send your Holy Spirit among us and our listeners so that we may all grow in wisdom of how you work in our lives and how you work in the universe and the ways we can get to know that. And we ask you to do this all through the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Kev. All right. So, do you guys have any reflections on last week? Last week, we obviously talked about dating. I personally got a ton of feedback, but I'm curious if you guys heard any feedback from anybody or if you have any like Ephrem, Sam, if you guys have any follow-up thoughts.
My only hope from the evening was that Eric Nyberg got a bunch of dates, and
He didn't need that. He
Did
didn't need
he?
that to get a bunch of. He wouldn't even need that to get a bunch of dates. He just needs Eric Nyberg.
I was just hoping women were calling him left and right and asking him out. And,
I love his mustache. He had a great joke at the end that everyone loved.
Oh, I did get a couple messages about Eric's mustache. Got a message from a friend, a married friend of ours, who thought it was like LOL funny when one of you made the joke about where two or more are gathered in his name. Eric Nyberg is there in their midst. Which is great. Really great. It's fun when people are like, yeah, that one joke you guys made was so funny. Those are just the highlights.
All the other ones I didn't understand because they were happening in the Zoom group.
Well, yeah. So what are we going to do about that? Are we going to not use...
If our viewers did not know this already, we have a group chat in the Zoom call that we have used for just our own fun purposes. And I'm so sorry, our jokes have been out of context.
And that's good. Actually, Dan, it's a good.
I apologize.
Well, it's good you mentioned that too, because a lot of times you guys will say the chat, and so as it's my first time participating in TCI as a panelist, if you will, but I've actively participated, as a chatter on YouTube, and so oftentimes I'll hear the chat, and I'm like, what in the world are they talking about?
So Sam and Ephrem are like, yes, I want to use the chat.
So now I get the private,
the inside chat.
Exactly.
Inside chat.
So we are
you guys.
We are laying it to rest today, sort of.
Kind of, potentially.
Okay.
I feel a little sad about that, but not that.
Use it just once so I can have experienced it.
Okay.
For the record, Ephrem just used it.
He said,
and if you don't use it, you do lose it. So
if you don't use it, you lose it. All right, let's move into the point of this. So today we're talking about faith and science. Gosh, does anybody want to kind of define what this tension is? So why do some secular people, Catholics, I don't know, maybe some Catholics think this. Why do some have the impression that faith and science are in conflict with one another? And are they actually in conflict? Any thoughts about that? Come on, guys.
Feel like you're going to say something, Kevin.
Well,
go, Kev, go.
Sure. All right. So the idea is that the tension between faith and science is a pretty modern thing. And they kind of go back and look at all the points in the history, and they pick out all these things that say that faith and science are in tension, are at odds with each other. They can't really work together. And as you said, this thought is not just held by people who are by scientists or people in the secular world. It's held by Catholics. It's held by Christians, other religious people. It might be even more strongly held by fundamental Christians than by the scientists, to be honest. And is
that true?
That's
do you guys
me.
have that impression?
I have that impression. I don't. Yeah. I say that without any sort of evidence. I think if you talk to a lot of scientists, that they'll kind of agree that faith has its place. Maybe that might be too strong a statement, but it's really it's fundamental Christians who have really pushed out science, saying the only way to get to truth is the Bible, just the Bible. And I think that a lot of the secular folks are reacting against that. They're saying well, faith has pushed out science, and so science is going to push out faith. Now, there's a lot of Enlightenment stuff that the whole period of just, we've kind of evolved beyond the need for religion or faith or any sort of that superstitious stuff. And so that's kind of the side that the secular folks come at it, is that we've outgrown our need for religion. And they look at a lot of like these, like the Roman and the Greek religions, a lot of religions that, were based on kind of these irrational, emotional gods, and there wasn't much reason to anything. But when we say that there's a tension between faith and science, it's more of in my view, it's more of they're doing different things, right? They're doing different things. And so
are they doing different things?
Well, I mean, science itself can only answer certain questions. Science can't answer the question of why is there something rather than nothing. Why, how do we know that science is the only way to know things? Like those are philosophical questions that science is not equipped to answer, and science never was equipped to answer. And for the longest time, that people could do science and be faithful. Now I want to get into this later of like, I think we sometimes like we use we try to find these overlaps and use it to defend the Catholic Church, like, oh, faith and science, like there's no conflict, whatever, the guy who who theorized the Big Bang, oh, he's a Catholic priest, and we throw off all this different stuff. Sometimes I wonder how if that's actually effective. We can get into that later. But I guess just a little overview of faith and science. Faith is answering, and theology is answering maybe bigger questions of why we're here and what the meaning of life is, that science can never answer those questions. As much as you try to prove it in a lab, science will never be able to answer the question of what is the meaning of life? Why is there love? I mean, they try to, like, they try to strip out all those things and reduce it to like brain waves and synapses and all that stuff. And there's always a biological explanation for a lot of things, not everything. But I think a lot of faithful people would tell you that who don't have an issue with science is that the more science tells us, the more it actually points towards the existence of God.
Okay.
I'll step back and let other people talk.
I mean, I think just to expand on that, Kevin, at least in my experience, a lot of the sort of tension and pushback from folks that are maybe secular or atheist, they're really attacking more of a caricature of religion rather than authentic religion itself. So they may, like, I remember the first sort of exposure to this was, I watched a movie in college called Religulous. I don't know if you guys remember that. Bill Maher.
Bill Maher.
Yeah. So he was interesting movie. He basically took his camera crew around and was interviewing a bunch of these sort of fundamentalist Protestant groups. And then he would ask them basic scientific questions that were kind of irrefutable, and these folks were not equipped at all to answer. So his sort of big takeaway was, religious people are sort of rubes, they're sort of dumb, and they're just sort of clinging on to these superstitions or whatever. Hence, science and reason are better. But he wasn't actually he wasn't actually going up against somebody who, was very well versed in philosophy and theology and had some rebuttal. It was sort of going up against the sort of lowest denominator. And I feel like a lot of folks that feel that tension between faith and reason are sort of they kind of have a misunderstanding of what Christianity is, specifically Catholicism.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, Marty, that you basically interchanged science with reason. So
how they would characterize it.
Yeah. So can you elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, do you think, to be totally honest, I never really thought about it that way before, but I guess, do you think that like secular culture sort of associates science with what we would consider to be reason? What's your thought about that?
Well, I would think that rather than that, maybe they would sort of oppose faith and reason for some reason. That was interesting. They would oppose the two, rather than saying science and reason are the same. But
who would oppose? I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood you. Who would oppose faith and reason?
Folks that are non-religious.
Oh, okay.
Might set up that dichotomy.
Okay. Set them up as a dichotomy and say faith and reason oppose each other. Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But somebody who's Catholic or has a more nuanced understanding of both faith and reason know that that's just not the case.
Right.
Specifically in Catholic thought. So,
interesting.
I think it's just a misunderstanding that folks have.
Right. Dan, I feel like you were going to say something earlier.
I guess all I was going to do is pretty much echo what Kevin said, but also I remember when we were learning in the seminary, when we were learning about, it's kind of like this, just kind of digging more into this relationship between faith and science, and just understanding that faith itself is also a way of knowing. Because like the implicit assumption nowadays is that the only things that can be known are those things that our senses can actually perceive, right? But faith itself can also be a way of knowing something. Now just because we can't necessarily put into our senses what like our faith is perceiving doesn't mean that it's not knowledge. There's also like, when we say faith, we don't mean just kind of like, some random idea that pops in and I just kind of believe that that's true, right? For example, the existence of God, that can be something that's demonstrated even if we can't understand God in his fullness, right? Like science cannot even begin to grapple like the fullness of God. But at the same time, with faith, we believe that God has revealed himself to us, and he reveals himself to us not only in the natural world, but he himself reveals himself to us in the person of Jesus Christ, and like in the teachings of Jesus Christ, and through human history, as we see in the Bible. And so now, of course, there's a lot of factual events that we can say like, oh, that actually like happened. But in terms of like encountering the person of Jesus Christ in our own lives, or in believing in what the church has taught us based on what Jesus and the apostles have given us, like those are ways of knowing things that that's another way that God has revealed himself to us, even if it hasn't necessarily been through like the way that we conduct science nowadays.
Yeah.
I think, Dan, building off that a little bit too, you talked about how like faith and reason are, not as like they're intertwined together. And I think people need to realize, and I think, a lot of times Catholics, we kind of realize this too, but I think sometimes scientists themselves don't realize this. There's also an intertwining of science and faith from the perspective of, these are all theories, like the Big Bang theory, the theory of relativity. There's maybe a lot of evidence that points to these, but these are all examples of things that there is even a tiny bit of faith that all these scientists have. Now, it's not a faith in God, but it's a faith in the theory. So
faith
even
in the science.
Faith in the science, yeah. So it's not like, science has a 100% clear, can explain everything perfectly. They're always, even in the science, there's normally a little bit of a trust or an assumption, or kind of a guess or conclusion that, okay, well, this A says B, and that probably means C, but it doesn't necessarily mean C. So even the science side does that too, which is another thing to think about.
Yeah, I love how science is just as much an act of faith as believing in religion. Because, if you believe that, only things that can be like perceived through the senses, that's the only thing you can know for sure. But even that's an act of faith. Like, how do you know that? So yeah, I think it is really funny. Like, you're going to have to take an act of faith one way or the other. You're either going to have to be like, well, I'm going to hedge my bets and, believe that God exists and can work in the world, or I'll take a belief of faith the other way. But I don't know. I think it irritates me when like the new atheists are so just like confident that they're, you know, in their knowledge. But they really can't be any more confident than anyone else.
Whoa, guys, cool. I wasn't expecting it to go any of those places, but that was really interesting. So how long do you feel like you guys have been aware of some of these tensions? Like, what are your, like, I don't know, like for me, for example, I remember learning about Aristotle in school and learning about that whole, is that even right? Am I correct? Earth is round. Am I crazy?
Is Earth round?
Is Mary Kay correct?
Kyrie Irving.
The Earth is round.
Kyrie Irving.
Here's Monica. So the Earth is round.
Kyrie Irving is a flat earther. Are you thinking like Galileo?
Okay, so the Earth is round.
Education, Marty.
Was that? Am I crazy? Was that?
Aristotle. I mean, wait, you would have thought that that was not his most famous discovery. That I would say. Are you thinking about Galileo?
The sun. Oh, that's what I'm thinking of. Galileo. See, wow. Aren't you guys glad that I'm not just doing this myself? Okay, Galileo, that's what I'm thinking of. So the church like told Galileo, like excommunicated him, correct? Is that right?
It's a very complicated.
Are we all thinking about the same thing?
Yeah, no, we
Something like that.
Or am I thinking of the correct thing? What's happening right now? Would someone please correct me?
So you're right. Is that one of the points? One of the big things that, like when I said before, like that we've kind of retcon history to fit the modern narrative of the tension of faith and science. And you had a long time teaching that the Earth was the center of the universe. And there's already, you know, some folks that were coming out with like that's maybe not accurate. And then it was Galileo who he discovers that there's something orbiting around moons orbiting around Jupiter, and so well then not everything's orbiting around the Earth. So there's something, and so he started to do these kind of teachings, and the church this is a long story short, it was like, you know, pump the brakes, you know, you're trying to teach us as absolute truth, and almost like the church is saying like you're doing bad science, like you are trying to trumpet that you're finding and like make these wide sweeping conclusions. Now the conclusions he was making turned out to be right, but the church was kind of like let's, you know, pump the brakes, and he didn't, and so that's what led him to be. I don't know if he was actually excommunicated, but he definitely was put in some sort of, he was kind of in prison silence a little bit. Now that was, you know.
Wow, did I even go to a Catholic school?
Sure you would not have learned this in like
that'll be our
you would not have learned this in Catholic school. Like it's a very complicated history, and it's.
Was your grade school even Catholic? That's our next topic.
Oh god, jeez. That's a
just kidding.
Question.
That was a bad joke. Just kidding.
But yeah, everyone points back to that moment, and like, was the church like absolutely in the right? I mean, no, in the sense of they were telling him to stop teaching this thing that ended up being right. But they were doing it for the reasons of, you are potentially shaking a lot of things that like affect a lot of things. I mean, church teaching develops slowly, right? It's like, let's look at how these things affect. And he was just going ahead and like kind of bulldoze ahead, and he shouldn't have been. So, yeah.
To take this back to the question, what I guess the reason I brought that up is I was using that as an example of like, this was the first thing I didn't really actually learn, about whether or not science and faith are consistent. So like, do you guys have, I mean, is there like one thing in particular you think of when you think about this topic, like something in particular that was at some point maybe up for question, or that you learned about that, you know, like evolution, or I don't know, something else?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say it's evolution. So when I was in grade school, like we were learning about evolution. I mean, just like very generally and very briefly, as much as like whatever it was, 6th or 7th grade allowed. But I remember my teacher looking back, while she was a great teacher, she did not understand the relationship between like faith and science. Like her job was to teach science. Mm-hmm. And even though she was a Catholic school teacher, like she did not understand, like it was, you know, like there's such a thing as saying, well, oh yeah, the church doesn't have a problem with that. But it's another thing to say, like evolution actually, like if like with evolution being true, like what does that mean for our understanding of the human person? Like that's a whole nother conversation, which is really, really cool. So evolution was a big one for me. One of the things that Father John Carchi, the rector at Mundelein Seminary, told us in our class is when you read the scriptures, like as you should read the scriptures like and ask like scientific questions. Like what does that look like is definitely one of those. But like, so when you see something like God is love, like stop right there and just like think about that. Okay. Like what on earth does that mean based on what we know about, you know, like the physics of different things, for example. And so like when we talk about faith and science, like in seventh grade, it's not just like, yeah, the church is okay with that and move on. Like you got to unpack that a little bit. And hopefully, you know, if you understand faith and science and you're a scientist or a theologian, that you don't just know like, oh yeah, these are both good, but that they actually like, they illuminate each other in this very beautiful way.
Right.
You actually, to be Dan Corrential a little bit, can you give an example of that? Because I'll be honest, I've totally fallen into that bucket of just like, yeah, faith and science are compatible. Great, let's move on. But apparently there's something.
They are compatible or they aren't compatible? They are. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just curious, like how, maybe we're getting too far ahead, but I'm just curious how it enriches your faith life, or if you can give an example of that.
Yeah. So one thing that I really took away from that class with Father Carchi is we were talking about, theory of relativity and kind of just understanding the way that time works. So one of the things that Einstein realized is that time is like relative, like it, and Kevin's going to have to correct me as I go along here because I'm going to try to regurgitate what I was learning. But so basically just like, so we experience time in different ways. And one of the things that was proposed is that time itself may actually already exist. And what happens is, so like Einstein was able to prove that you could go, what was it, Kevin? Like you could go forward in time, like based on the direction, if the direction you were going at the speed of light relative to another object. And so basically, so the biggest takeaway that I remember from that point was that time itself may already exist. Well, so when we talk about God, if God is truly present to each moment, like then God is able to do so because like time itself is already there. And so God is able to be like actually present like throughout like all of human history, in a way that that's very different from like the way we experience time. I don't know if that made any sense, but I don't know if Kevin wants to elaborate on any kind of like stuff like that or the stuff that he learned.
Yeah, go.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna kind of go back to that sort of evolution point for a minute. So yeah, just sort of reiterate that point about like even in the sciences, it takes a tremendous amount of faith to even put together a good scientific theory. So like the theory of evolution, for example, like if you look at, you know, paleontology or, you know, the human skulls they found and all this stuff, there's quite a bit of piecing things together, right? To like form a coherent theory and narrative, right? And for that to work, I mean, nothing is 100% certain. And even like the theory of evolution has gone through many iterations over the centuries and is quite a bit different now than what it was when like Darwin, you know, wrote his original theory. So like when we talk about like, you know, a lot of people like sort of compare, you know, creationism versus, and, you know, evolution, for example. And what we know for certain, right, from a place of faith is that everything written in the Old Testament, right, is true, but it doesn't mean that it's scientifically, you know, 1 + 1 = 2 true. Like it's not necessarily like that. It could be, maybe we don't fully understand it, but it's not supposed to be viewed 100% in that lens. But on the science side, you know, like something like evolution is always evolving as more knowledge comes into place. And the theory is always being refined and thought anew. So it's not even like a very good comparison, like evolution versus creation, because there's sort of different genres, I would think. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Well, so that's leads me to another question. So yeah, it seems like there are a lot of theories out there, and they may provide decent explanations to account for reality. So I guess it could be the case that everything is just material and it's chemicals firing in our brains that produce love and all these other complex things. But then it could also be the case that there's a loving God who created us, and the kind of that whole theory as well. So I'm just wondering, and Kevin, you were alluding to this in the beginning, but for us who are questioning, like, why should we side with one theory or the other? I guess if they're all possible, like, is there a certain amount of evidence that just leads you up to believe, like, you know what, just like this theory just seems more compelling to me, and I'm gonna have faith that there is a God?
It's tough because you don't want to like necessarily call God a theory. Because the way like philosophy and theology have kind of defined, like if you use like say Aquinas's 5 proofs, like you kind of logically conclude there must be a God, and then he walks you through to like why it's the Christian God and what are all those properties, what have you. Whereas maybe you could get to a point with like the theory of evolution, or even like gravity is still technically a theory where that's pretty repeatable and pretty confirmed. So that's when we say theory in science, it's pretty well accepted that is how things work. I think it's important. Like you bring up a good question. That's why the Catholic Church is never going to side with some sort of scientific theory over the other, right? It'll certainly say like, this theory is completely plausible and it has no issues with faith. It said that with evolution, with saying like, as long as you believe this, this, and this, like evolution completely works. The Big Bang Theory works. Like I said, it's Catholic priests thought of it. But as Sam was saying, like something could turn out to be completely wrong or just not fully the truth. And so if the Catholic Church sides with it and they say this is the way it was, and then it turns out, well, that actually science is showing us that it's not that way. Okay, well, what does that say about the church and her infallible teaching, faith and morals, all that? But it is why, and same with philosophy, like why the church has never adopted like a specific philosophy. It kind of just borrows from all these, like, truth where you can find it is a quote that I try to live by, and I think that's something good. Is like, if you can find truth in there's a big. I remember there was a flare up on Slack about this probably 6 months ago of like what's the point of watching like these videos or doing like believing these certain things, like are they of any help? And often sometimes no, but truth where you can find it, like there are true things even in things that are mostly false. Well, there's a point of truth there, and we can use that, and it points back to God. So I don't know if I answered your question, Ephrem, but that's.
I kind of want to maybe dig in on that a little bit, because here's the thing: is that my job is pretty contingent on scientific reality. Like life either begins at fertilization or it doesn't. And I don't know. I have so many thoughts about this. I think a lot about how Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So we cannot separate what is true from Christ. We can't do it. So like, Kev, I don't know if maybe I'm just misunderstanding the way you're saying it, or if maybe I'm just misunderstanding the point you're trying to make, but the church does make declarations about certain scientific truths because we have to, because we can't just say like
maybe with the ethics of it, not the truth of it. There's like, obviously there's truths that you can say like, this is scientifically accurate and it works, but ethically it's bad. At the church, that's where the church would step in. Like say with, right now, very, very controversial is, and you talk about this all the time, the using fetal stem cells to create vaccines, right?
Yep.
Scientifically, the church said, what the church would say, this is me, I believe it, it'd be like, yes, that works. And we see that works. And it's frankly, this, please listen, do not hear
I'm listening.
what I'm not saying, because I'm going to say something that is going to sound weird. Like, almost that is an amazing thing that they're able to do. They're able to take this and turn it into a vaccine. Scientifically, that's kind of incredible. But obviously, it's incredibly, incredibly, incredibly problematic. And that's when the church would step in ethically and say, okay, obviously, it's a huge no-no because it's coming from aborted fetal cells that requires abortion, which is intrinsically evil, and in no way can ever happen. And so, like, the science can't actually happen. But there's nothing necessarily like flawed or untrue about the science. It's the ethical implications of what that science goes to. And I think that's where the church steps in and say, like, yeah, like this is. I mean, there's a truth here. Like, this process works, but you're violating the fullness of the truth, which, as you've already said, is Jesus Christ. So I think it's when we talk about more of the fullness of truth is found in Jesus Christ. We have to think about the fullness of truth. When I say truth is where you can find it, the fullness of the truth is found in Jesus Christ and his church.
Okay, that's fine. I'm not going to discount any of that. But here's the other piece of that is that there is scientific evidence that using embryonic stem cells as opposed to other stem cells actually has horrible implications for the human body. So that's an example of the reality that science actually is consistent with certain evils. And we can look at other things like theology of the body is maybe the number one way to point to the reality that like science is consistent with faith, because let's look at the science of sex. Like, let's look at the science of like that physical act and what that looks like. Let's look at the science of contraceptives. Like
dating was last week, Mary Kate, come on.
Well, this is my favorite topic. We could look at the
science of dating.
The science of dating. No, well, never mind. I'm not going to say what I was going to say. We could look at the science. Okay, so here's a little scientific tidbit for you, which I think this is an example of how I feel like science is amazing when we're talking about it within the context of faith and truth. So you hear people talk about contraceptives, the pill is bad for you, whatever. The big argument we get is, well, why can't you use a condom? So scientifically, there is actually a problem with using a condom in sex. Sorry, I'm just going to straight go there because this is a great example. Yeah, this is a great example. So there is scientifically a problem with using a condom because the woman's body, when she receives that ingredient from the man, has been like she develops like it provides certain nutrients and other things that she needs in order to carry a child in her womb. So leading up to conception, she needs that. But if you're contracepting, even without an artificial hormone, even without that, even just, basically at the very basic level of using a condom, you're creating a problem for the body scientifically. So like, that's how tied and connected to faith science actually is that our faith says that you can't even put a barrier between two people who are having sex because it creates a spiritual barrier, but the biology of the act actually reinforces that reality, which is amazing, which is so amazing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times in a lot of ways we see that faith or ethics like is people perceive that as like, look at what we're able to do with science, but we put a stop on it because of like some arbitrary ethical concerns or something like that. But what's really cool, and I think Mary Kate, especially like with theology of the body, when you hear like speakers like Vicky Thorne talk about this kind of stuff, where it's like what you literally see is the like what the church teaches about these things, like we see them being scientifically manifested in the world, and it's like, holy cow, like God is actually not only just like telling us like, okay, like this is what we should do, but also like, here is the scientific evidence of like what he's talking about, right? Like the greatest union of faith and science is the person of Jesus Christ, right? So like God himself, like God, who cannot be scientifically perceived whatsoever, becomes a physical human being, right? Like, how is that even possible? But like God himself right there is showing like these two things belong in perfect unity because I'm trying to reveal myself in faith and in science. So the greatest revelation of God is when the two of those come together in the person of Jesus Christ. And so we should never see we should never see like ethics or faith as a constraint to science. And I mean, we could say a whole lot of things about like science right now is all about like, what can we do? And if we can do it, we should do it because it's science and it's cool. And look what humankind can do. But that's all like pride. That's our like a way of controlling. That's a whole nother, a whole nother tidbit. But yeah, just like, so like there's not only just like, oh yeah, we can have both these things, but like the interweaving of them, as you're saying.
Yeah. And Dan, I would even go a little bit further than that. It's definitely, control, but even more than that, I think it's like us grasping acknowledge that we can't actually have. So like, I think the human experience can be defined by like us seeking to understand mysteries that we'll never understand. And like, that's like, that goes all the way back to the garden. Like we've inherited that from
we'll
Adam
never
and
like
Eve.
fully understand.
Right.
Yeah,
we'll never
definitely.
fully understand.
Sure.
So I just think it's interesting that you say it that way, because I think that like, that's what we've done with science. We've taken science, we've taken the ability to like perceive matter, and we've said like, we have the capacity as human beings to understand this in fullness all on our own without any sort of divine intervention at all, purely because it's human pride, like we just say like that we're capable of that. But I think without faith, there are just inevitably things we can't grasp. I was going to go on to the next point unless anyone has any thoughts about that.
Let's see if anyone else wants to add on to that.
Thoughts? No. Okay. So with regards to where we're at right now, coronavirus, abortion obviously is a big thing. I could talk about that forever. Why is this idea of like the tension between faith and science, or like this conversation, why is this so relevant right now?
Is it relevant just right now, or do you think, because I feel like it's almost throughout, maybe not throughout history, but
that's a fair point, Sam.
Especially the 20th century onward, probably especially like starting like the 1960s onward even. But yeah, I do think it has kind of manifested itself a lot in a little bit more recent years. And what's interesting too is people are on both sides trying to use science, I think, to prove their point. Mainly talking about the abortion debate, especially. You have our side, the pro-life side, that points to at conception, a person is made, has DNA, and then the other side, the pro-choice side, will say, oh, but it doesn't have a heartbeat until X weeks. So it is a little bit interesting that in some debates, both sides are trying to use science to prove the other one, to disprove the other one. So it's also not always just faith versus science. Sometimes it can even be like science versus science, or what science is the true science, or kind of almost going back to what Dan said earlier, how he mentioned how science is always looking forward and what human heights can we reach potentially, but sometimes the consequence of that is not evaluating what science are we kind of throwing away in the process too. So I think those are all different things to consider as well.
I think another interesting point to keep in mind is, science is often weaponized, right? Especially for political purposes. So like you tend to hear the phrase, trust the science, right? Trust the science when it comes to a variety of things. Something like climate
coronavirus.
Well, that's what I was, all trust the science.
Are you hinting at a conspiracy theory, Dan? Keep going,
That's
Marty.
not what I was saying.
That's what I'm saying.
Sorry, Marty, go ahead.
That's a topic for another day. Keep going, Marty.
Well, I think we have to be careful with that though, because I think politicians they're social scientists, right? They're trying to make decisions based on limited information and weighing costs and benefits and so on. If they're good politicians, some are not good, but And so, like, let's say you have to make a decision about, locking down your city, for example, for an extended period of time during coronavirus, right? You have to weigh your, the scientific relevance of how deadly the disease is. And on the other hand, you have to weigh the economic impact and so on, which is good. And that's a healthy way to sort of use science, right? It's a tool, but it's not like the be all end all, right? And particularly because science, just by its very nature, it changes. It's always updating. It's always evolving. It's growing as we get more knowledge. And, if you're going to cite, a scientific paper in a peer-reviewed journal, for example, that paper gains more relevance over time or becomes less relevant over time. As more studies are done, or the same study is done over and over again, and gets the same results. So it's just dangerous, like, particularly when we use science in politics to sort of jump to a really quick conclusion about something based on the science, because often that's not how science works. It's finding truth over a lot of trial and error over a lot of time. So,
right.
Yeah, so I'm just always a little bit suspicious of, jumping, when we're going to talk about politics, jumping right to, what is the science of the day saying,
Yeah, and I think that the reason society is so quick to believe in scientific evidence goes back to the Enlightenment, where it was, I don't know, just kind of agreed upon that, scientific evidence is just the most reliable type of evidence. And I think that's why our society is just so keen now to try to justify whatever you believe in with some type of science. And so that leads to all kinds of things. And I think that's why people try to justify whatever they believe with science. But I think I see that as kind of a separate question of like how science and faith can fit together. Because to me, that just seems to be more a question of like, there were lots of things that we used to ascribe to maybe religion because we didn't understand them. Like going back to early days, like the rising of the sun, people didn't know what the sun was. So they're like, oh, it must be a god. And then they realized, oh, it's actually this big ball of gas burning billions of miles away. And so they modified their beliefs accordingly. And so I think just like a lot of things that people once ascribed to religion, they're now finding that science has a different account of it. And so I think that can put people on the defensive, religious people on the defensive, just because they are worried that science is going to come along and like discredit something that they believe, or just like a fondly cherished belief that they have one day.
And I think that kind of goes back to what Kevin was talking about earlier about why the Catholic Church a lot of times stays out of the scientific, of saying this is 100% right scientifically, because especially if it's not necessary to the faith, if there's a scientific theory that, doesn't really impact, people's faith and morals, doesn't impact, salvation, doesn't impact worshiping God, why is the church now? Sometimes there might be an important scientific, stance, again, like kind of related to abortion and things like that. That's just one example where it might benefit the church to, come out in a certain way. Obviously, Pope Francis has had his encyclical about the environment. So it's not like, the church is always going to stay on the sideline, but it's kind of like almost a why jump into something, A, if we don't have to, and B, if we don't know the answer. And if the answer doesn't really impact, our faith, it doesn't impact the salvation of souls, it doesn't impact the worship of God, then is it really something to, get into fights over?
Go, Mary Kate.
I wish you guys could understand how frustrating it is for me to hear some of what you're saying. And it's not that I disagree with you necessarily so much as like in the abortion conversation, first of all, to your earlier point, Sam, like, yeah, there might be some instances that like the pro-choice movement is like using science to argue against us, but mostly they're not. Mostly what they're saying is like a human being doesn't have a sense of self or personhood until they're like
Well, can I rephrase what I was saying a little bit?
well, yeah, that's fine.
I think what they would do is they might twist scientific arguments to sound, good. So I agree that I don't think they often have a legitimate point, but they'll try to twist certain words certain ways. I guess is more of what the lines I was going for.
I just think that it's a legitimate example of what we're talking about, and I think that it's really easy for us to like give credence to science and say like science, there's a lot of legitimacy there that just doesn't totally match up with what we believe. And so that's why the church doesn't take a stance on things. I happen to think that the church not taking a stance on a lot of things that I personally think are pretty obvious science is like kind of weak and not the right way to go about it. And I think that with regards to like, I don't know, I could say this about a lot of things. There's a lot of things. I actually really believe that if we really, really look deeply at science, it is incredibly consistent with the faith. But I think that we I think a couple things. First of all, I think we stop short of looking into stuff because we're afraid of what might be on the other side of that truth. And then, in addition to that, I think that the unwillingness to have the conversation leads people to believe that secular society owns science and that the church has no place in that conversation. And
that's true.
We all know that that is vehemently false. So I struggle with that. And I think, and I bring up the abortion issue and contraception and theology of the body because all of that is what I do on a regular basis. And that's the most prominent example for me, but I see it regularly. And the longer I'm in this job and do this work, the more I am like, it is amazing how science supports everything we believe. And it's also amazing that the world seems to think they have a claim to science when science continues to support. I mean, you guys, like miracles, like when we talk about like biblical miracles, they're not just like things that people were like, wow, that's amazing. They were like scientific miracles. Or like the Eucharist.
Whoa.
What?
By definition, a miracle can't be like
supernatural.
The walking on water, the radical healing, like those aren't.
They can't be explained with science. That's what I mean. They were scientific miracles.
No, I don't.
You
I
said
think
the
you
opposite.
said the opposite.
Yeah.
You said the opposite.
I didn't mean that. They're scientific. They
Yeah.
can't be explained with science. But that's what I mean when I say they're scientific miracles. They cannot be explained scientifically. They are miraculous. They cannot be explained with science.
No longer a hot take. Sorry, go ahead, Simon.
I think that also is. Go ahead, Mary Kay, finish your thought.
I mean, I guess that's the end of my thought. I think like I don't appreciate the whole like, yeah, the church doesn't take a stance on stuff because you know what? I happen to think that's a lot of BS when the church doesn't take stance.
Okay, but what happens?
The bishops should take a stance on things.
But what happens if like science? We've said for sure that science changes all the time. So what happens when the science you put 100% backing on by the apostles, the successors to the apostles, turns out to be not entirely true?
Don't we do that already? Like we say the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ.
Yes, because that's 100% true. That is revealed by God.
We already do that.
Lie.
Okay, but like I also don't think there's anything wrong. I also don't think there's anything wrong with like the church saying like, yes, this science is consistent with truth and this science is not. And then if we find something out that it's different, then we can go back and be like, you know what? We were wrong. And it's okay that we were wrong.
So
there's a difference between saying that science is consistent with the truth that we believe and saying that this science is 100% accurate and we should.
Okay, well, I don't even know an example of what that would be. Like, I don't know. Like, there are other things scientifically. There are just other things that like the church should take a stance on, and we don't. But I don't know what example, Kev. I don't know what example you're thinking of. Yes.
An example, I think.
You're talking about revealed truths. Like the Eucharist is a revealed truth. That's not a scientific truth.
I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about like like the specific things I'm thinking of are like things nobody wants to talk about on this podcast. Like vaccines, which none of us want to talk about on this podcast.
So like the church, for example, coming out and saying something along the lines of, I'll go back to like the global warming issue for a second. Like this is, if the church came out and made a scientific statement about this is the reason why the earth is warming A, B, C, and D, that could change 15 years from now as more science comes out, right? But the moral truth behind, what we should do to protect the environment, that's what the church can help us with, right? So I think is that the danger you're sort of piecing together there, Dan or Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, it's just dangerous if you're like when you're conflating the two, and you have these revealed truths. Because if you say like, okay, this is a truth of the church that's somehow doctrinally said, the church says like this, evolution is the truth. We believe that. We can say up to this point, or we can say yes, it's consistent with all these truths, and there's not nothing, but like there's a lot of things of evolution that are like, yeah, we can make this work with, like, it works with what's been revealed to us. The things that we know are true because they're revealed by a God who is truth. So, right, that's a given, and we work with that and we do. But if it comes out and says, okay, this evolution is actually not how it happened, well, then it puts everything into question, and then the church is forced to recant and say like, oh, this is actually not doctrine or something. It just there's like
it means the church isn't infallible.
Right, it makes the church, and as Sam mentioned before, he's like, a lot of these things are, not necessarily like, you don't have to believe that evolution. It's a way to explain something, but it doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on the revealed truths of the faith. It's a way to explain a lot of the things that we've seen, and actually we can piece this together with how the creation account in the Bible, there's truths to that. The evolution, there's scientific physical evidence that points back to this, and we can the two can work together and mesh. And like, and as you've been saying, Marty, like a lot of times it kind of like reveals even an even deeper, it reveals it even more than we already knew. It like takes this revealed truth and it's like, yeah, this is actually consistent with how the world physically works. Like we're seeing these things play out. I really want to drive home that like, when the church is not going to, it is not, and it shouldn't back these things. It can come out and say that yes, and I mean there's been papal letters about evolution and all these other things. They said, yeah, but there's no problem. Like, here's the things you need. Here's the things you need to believe if you want to believe in evolution based on the scientific evidence. There's no issue, provided you know that human beings have a soul and that God gave it to them, and that there was a point where man can, like, those theological truths that are revealed. Then yeah, it can work together. But for the church just to put its full weight behind something, it's a dangerous game.
Yeah,
Well,
it is.
And I think it's important to clarify like what we mean by if the church declares something, because we say that the church is infallible, meaning it can't be wrong in matters of faith and morals. And so if the Pope makes a decision, what we call ex cathedra, like from the chair of Peter in the church, then that means that it is truth and it can't be wrong. So that's why I think popes are hesitant to make infallible claims about science for the exact reasons we've been saying, is because theories change all the time. So if a pope comes out and says this theory is correct infallibly, and then it turns out not to be correct, then that means that the Pope isn't infallible, which means that basically our entire faith is wrong. It doesn't even
need to be infallible either.
Give me an example of a moment that's ever even been like.
It hasn't happened.
Well, that's my point. But
that's why the Pope abstains from doing it.
So
But is
it's
that why the
important,
Pope
I think.
abstains? Or like, I don't know that we necessarily know that. My understanding has always been that like when the Pope is going to make like an ex cathedra statement, it's like,
It's only happened twice.
well, exactly. So we don't necessarily know
Like
that
it's
they're
happened more than
intentionally avoiding doing it just because they're
Look,
afraid.
the church has
that
made
science
a lot
will
of statements that on faith and morals and doctrine and so on over the years
Right.
that we have to believe.
Right.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the church can make statements on science or, you know, talk about certain studies and so on as being, oh, these are things we should look at, but we're not required to believe any of them if they don't.
Right. The same way you're not required to believe private revelation, or there's a lot of things you're not required to believe as a Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
But it's saying it, but the church is there to say like it's okay to believe this. It's like it's you know, there's nothing wrong with believing in Fatima, just like there's nothing wrong with believing in evolution. Like the church says, the church is not. It just basically says like here's a scientific truth that's out there, and here's how we can here's how we as Catholics can respond to that finding, that truth, as Marina points out in the comments.
Yeah. So here's my thing is that we're doing a lot of talking about like, what does the church say we have to believe and we should believe and we blah, 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 all these things. To me, there's a difference between what the church says we have to believe. Let me back up. The church, there are things out there that the church might say, you don't have to believe this. But for me, that's not really the question. The question is this true? So I think that we're creating a potential problem for ourselves when we're looking at everything as, well, what does the church say about this? Because when we're saying, what does the church say about this? I mean, and obviously you have to take that with a grain of salt, because on the flip side of that, you know, we do have to listen to the church about some things. But if there are things that the church is like, well, we're not really willing to take a stance on this, does that mean it's untrue? No, absolutely not. And I think that
conflicting.
I hear a lot of that is like, people are like, well, the church hasn't confirmed that, like that's not validated.
Yeah,
Like, that doesn't mean it's not true.
Sure. I mean, look at Marian apparitions. There's been 2,500 in the last 2,000 years, and the church has weighed in on less than one, probably about 1 to 2% of them. Not because like they don't. It's not because they don't care, right? It's like, but there are certain ones that had major implications, and so like, and I think that kind of goes into the scientific discussion as well. Where it's like when evolution became a lot more well known, like the church weighed in on that, because it's like this has a lot of implications in how we understand God and how we understand the human person. And so it's important for the church to be on like up with the signs of the, like up with the times, like what's going on and how do we see the world today. And like if science can fit into that and helping us understand that, to understand more, then that's a good thing. But like that, the church is not going to weigh in on every single thing. And so
even like widely accepted science, like maybe Big Bang Theory or evolution, it's still important from, you know, the faithful's point of view that we're still not required to believe it in order to be a holier person.
That's a great point.
So, I mean, I think, yeah, that kind of, Kevin, to your point, that's sort of the reason for kind of for the church not to be like creating, you know, infallible doctrine based on science or whatever.
Yeah, it's important to keep all this in context. The science is supposed to fit into a bigger picture of like, our relationship with God. Sorry, Kevin, go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, and it's not even like the infallible thing. I mean, that for the church to come out and not even say infallibly, because I mean, I'm pretty sure you can only be infallible on matters of faith and morals. I don't know where science initially fit into that. It might not. But for the church to like strongly back something and then and say this is it, even if it's not speaking infallibly, or I mean, it just, when you're wrong, it just like every time someone's wrong about something, you like, and in a big way, then it just throws so many other things into question. So like, well, how can we believe that what they're saying about the priesthood's real, or all these things? Like it can get ridiculous, but it is just kind of the way the human mind works. And
we brought up Galileo at the beginning of this call, and
yeah,
that was 500 years ago, and it wasn't even. I mean, it's still misunderstood, and it's still being used against the Catholic Church.
I guess I just don't see why that matters. Like, things are either true or they're not. Like, there are stuff that bishops say all the time that I'm like, well, I don't really care.
Well,
about
that's
that
true, but what
because-
if they don't know? What if the church doesn't know? The church can know what's true from like faith and morals, but like there are certain, in some scientific stuff, yes, but there's some scientific stuff that the church might legitimately just not know. So why is it going to take a stance on something that it doesn't know the answer to? And then if that stance is later proven wrong,
Like it's not going to take a stance for the sake of taking a stance.
right? There are certain things the church absolutely should take a stance on, especially even when it
Yeah.
comes to science. There are other things where I don't think it's prudent for the church to do so, just because the church doesn't need to take a stance on everything just because it can.
Well, I'm certainly not saying that. I just think that, we know that the world points to science. So if there are areas that we can say the science is consistent, it's been consistent, I don't know. I think,
Well, in terms of the church like weighing in on things, I mean, it is important for the church to weigh in on scientific things, especially if it has to do with faith and morals, right? So like there may be some new scientific breakthrough or some new technology. Then it's absolutely necessary that the church weighs in and talks about the efficacy of it and the ethics and the morality of it, right? Because there's authority there that the church has. But to confirm whether or not the science is good science or true, or to do its own studies, I mean, I think that's all kind of secondary for the church.
Right. And you can point to stuff like the church can always point to, if they wanted to, like, hey, this is like Mary Kate, what you're saying, like you're like some of the science you're doing is bad science. You're doing bad science, and that is the primary issue is that this is a moral problem. This is an evil. Don't do evil. And actually, the bad science you're doing is actually backing up the fact that this is evil. And I think that's what you're kind of saying is like there's a lot of like bad science and these things that we think are true are not, or it's not working the way we do, and it supports our truth. And I think the church, there's no issue for the church to point to that. It's just that it's the deciding like this is it.
Well, and that's kind of related to the vaccine point too a little bit. The church came out with a stance against, if you can, if it's available to you, do not get a vaccine that has been created using embryonic stem cells and stuff. Like, so in that sense, like it's a moral imperative that the church is speaking from, it's not even as much, and kind of actually you mentioned this point earlier, Kevin, like it sounds bad and that you had to caveat, and I feel like I'm going to caveat it too. It's like, it's kind of an amazing development, but it doesn't matter because it came immorally, unethically, so I think the church isn't necessarily going to take a stance on the development itself. It's not taking a stance on the end, it's taking a stance on the means to the end in this particular example.
But I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at though, is that I don't think that, I don't know, you guys, this whole thing is so frustrating to me because I just feel like that's, Sam, what you're saying is exactly what I'm saying. Like, it's not amazing because I think that we have allowed the secular world to just take science and run with it. And the result of that is that the secular world can make whatever claims about science they want to make. So like science has gone from something that the church really had a little bit of a monopoly on for a long time, because the church, I mean, Tim said it in our initial email about this topic, the church invented science, basically. Like, some of the original scientists in world history were Catholics. Most of them actually.
I mean, there was science well before the Catholic Church, of course. Like,
well, I think Mary Kate.
I know, but the point I'm trying to make is like that, like the conversation around science and like it's like importance came so much in tow with the Catholic Church.
Sure, but when you said like the church invented science, it's like,
okay, well,
what do you mean when you say
I
that?
know that's not what I mean.
Well,
but so
I think that science is
you guys,
just a tool.
let me finish my thought. So with regards to what Sam was saying, it's gone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So can I wanted to ask you guys a question based on something that Sam, you were saying earlier, just kind of like, and Kevin, in terms of just like, these amazing discoveries that we make in the world of science. Like one of the things that I think is really cool is how like we get to playing the sandbox is not the best way to say it, but just like we get to like experiment and learn about like the world around us. And not only do we do that, like, and we learn new things of it, but it provokes these just like greater feelings of like one of them be just like wonder and awe, and not just kind of like, oh, like, and now I have made this new chemical, or like now we've made this new thing. But like even scientists will talk about their own experience, my brother being one of those. And like when you're in the laboratory and you discover something new, there's just this feeling of just like, holy cow, like this is incredible. There's something that like that kind of brings you out of yourself in a way. I'm wondering if any of you guys have experiences of that, whether it's like an experience in the natural world or maybe something specifically in a laboratory or a scientific finding. Is there anything in particular that's just like really kind of brought that out of you? I do have an experience of that, actually. Dan,
You
would
can
like
share.
Dan, would you share?
Dan,
Sure.
would you please share your experience
Yeah,
with us?
sure. So this is a legitimate question for all of you. This wasn't just me trying to set myself up. So
yeah, right. Whatever.
This actually happened last year. So my family and we all went to the Grand Canyon, and like I had been around a lot of like really cool like natural wonders before. Like I love mountains, and I love, you know, all the like the kind of like the alpine view and alpine feel that you get like in the Alps, for example, like in Switzerland. But I think for one of the first times that I can ever remember, last year, as I was standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon and I was just kind of looking around at the whole thing, I was trying to get my mind around the whole thing. And I just like, because as you look down in the canyon, if you've ever been there before, there's just there's almost like a mountain range at the bottom of it. And then there's rivers that are flowing down there that you can't even see because it's so far down. And you have all these different colored shades of rocks, and showing literally thousands, millions, I don't know, of years of like how the earth has changed, like right in front of you. And as I'm trying to just like kind of put all these pieces together, I had this moment of just like kind of almost like this like helplessness, just like I cannot actually like figure this out. Like I can't get my mind around this whole thing. And I just found myself just like very grateful to God. I don't know if I would have been able to put that into words like before I really like took my faith seriously, but yeah, it was just this really amazing moment. Just like, oh my God, literally, like, thank you for just this amazing thing. It reminded me a lot of like Psalm 8, where we read, you know, like when I see the works of your hands, the moon and the stars you've made, like, what is man that you care for him? We're just all of a sudden we're like, how do we like what are you doing, God? Like, how is it that, how do we fit into this amazing picture that you've placed us into? Like, what is our place here? We're so small, and yet you care for us. So it was just really cool moment. So
Yeah, sort of similar story to that. I was actually down in college. I was down in Florida working at a camp with Christian brothers, and is on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and there was a sunset just one day, and it was a beautiful sunset, like awe-inspiring naturally. But I was standing next to a Christian brother, and he just said something. I think his exact quote was, "And some people say that God isn't real." And it was really interesting because from a science standpoint, it's very easy to say, oh, you know, the earth rotates, and, you know, that's why the sun, it's not even like a God created the sun. It's just, you know, natural law. They wouldn't say natural law, maybe, but it's just, you know, the natural way of things. And so
that's a question that the Senate asks SCOTUS nominees. Do you believe in natural law?
Yes. Yeah, no, I was just gonna say so.
It actually is. They actually asked Clarence Thomas that. Keep going.
Have you watched any Clarence Thomas documentaries recently, Mary Kate?
Yeah, it's so good. It's so good.
Plug.
Keep going, Sam.
Shameless plug. No,
that was so tangential.
No. It's all good. But I guess basically it is kind of interesting how, depending on your perspective, you could take a look at that as either just meaning absolutely nothing. You know, if you're secular, it could just be, oh, just complete coincidence, or a sign of God's beauty and love in the world. And it really just kind of varies on if you have faith, you know, because the scientific explanation is the same.
I think
but the purpose of why
Well, that's kind of the thing is like if Christ isn't real, like if God isn't real, who cares about science? What authority does science have if there isn't some like higher existence that's invoking like an order of everything that makes it matter?
Does
that make sense?
That can answer the question of why. And sorry, Marty.
Well,
I
yeah.
think what happens is if you don't believe in God or some sort of higher power, then mankind becomes God, right? And so science furthers mankind to its greatness. And I suppose that can have some sort of appeal. I don't get it.
God destroys man and man creates dinosaurs. Dinosaurs eat man.
Woman and heresy.
Sorry, Marty.
No, I'm just making like
yes
atheistic appeal there. But no, I totally agree with you, Mary Kay. Like
the land before time.
There's no
Marty,
God.
I'm curious, like you did a lot of your own like research years ago on a lot of like the atheistic theories and like the explanations that they use scientifically to justify, no God or whatever. And I'm just curious, like, did you feel like was there anything you stumbled upon from a scientific perspective that you were like, that's pretty intriguing? Like either one way or the other, like whether it be like scientific realities that point to the existence of a God or like lack thereof, which kind of has the potential to convince us that there has to be something else because science can't explain all of it. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of nuances, right? And all kinds of arguments for God and not God.
Right.
I'm not the expert on any of that, but I mean, for me, there's like, for a lot of these arguments to make sense, you kind of have to go all the way back and you're like, okay, well, how did things begin, right? Like what was this first cause, if there was a first cause? And like, that's where I think if you don't have God as a first cause, you have to invent something that takes more faith to believe than a God.
Wow.
And like if you're going to believe in a multiverse theory, right? Or some kind of infinite loop of causality, that takes an incredible amount of faith.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I have enough faith to be that kind of atheist. So
that's a fascinating point.
That's interesting.
I don't know, but there's a lot of stuff. A lot of really smart atheists out there that go toe to toe with, the Bishop Barons of the world.
Is it possible to have a conversation about science and or about the existence or non-existence of a God without in some shape or form acknowledging, what am I trying to say? It's almost like, okay, like we were sitting at the Manor last night and we were talking about these different arguments between like either, Ephrem, you were there, right? We were talking about light, and like light either emits something or it like sucks up the darkness. And there's arguments that people have made that light actually just sucks up darkness as opposed to emitting something. And someone else at the table said, well, no, that's false because darkness is not something to be absorbed. Darkness is just the absence of light.
So lack of something.
Yeah, it's the lack of something. So is there a way to have like an intellectually honest conversation about science? And maybe none of you can answer this question, that doesn't in some shape or form invoke a lack of God or a lack of a higher being. Does that make sense what I'm trying to ask?
So I guess the biggest thing when I think of like when we talk about lack of, I mean, like that's the proper understanding of sin, right? Sin is the lack of something, like something not being it's something being less than like its real self, I guess, right?
Missed the mark.
Say again.
Missed, like I've always heard of sin described as missing the mark.
Yeah, as opposed to like we have this like power of evil and then we have like this power of goodness and they clash, kind of like we like Marvel movies or stuff like that. But darkness itself, right? And like Lucifer himself was an angel, right? Like he's a fallen angel. Like he fell from a higher place. He's not like this kind of like emergence of like dark, evil, terrible powers. I don't really know what it has to do with science, but But yeah, I guess when you're talking about the lack of thing, yeah, like I think that's relevant in like theologically. So
I mean, I think you're perfectly able to have a scientific conversation with another person without invoking any sort of higher power or faith, because that's not what science does. As soon as you go outside of that and start ascribing meaning to things, you've gone beyond science. Science, you're now entering into philosophy.
Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, yeah, I could sit down and we could have a conversation about the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and like, is the cat really dead, all that kind of stuff, and we could do that without evoking. Don't worry about it.
Leave it alone.
Without invoking.
Leave it alone.
A faith or meaning. I mean, we could just talk like this. Here's truths. Here's the evidence. Here's this. Here's that. I mean, to your point, I think those often just because human beings aren't segmented like that, and that science developed as part of this grander thing, as part of philosophy and theology. I mean, it's hard to just segment it off. We tried it, which we tried to do, is just kind of like push it off. It naturally kind of grows in. So I think so like science itself, yes, you can do that, but like science, like Marty, what you're saying, and I agree with you, is that science, it kind of always, it's just going to naturally, like, because it wants to push back past its bounds, it can't. And so when it pushes past its bounds, it goes into questions of philosophy that science can't answer, but there's plenty of philosophy that can. I mean, there's all the questions that science wants to answer. I mean, those have been questions that have been asked for well beyond the advent of science. I mean, the Greeks and the Romans and what have you, and at least in the West.
So another. I was just gonna say something. Ephrem, go.
Go, Ephrem.
All right. Well.
Yeah, Dan's happy to tell Ephrem to go instead of me. Go ahead, Ephrem.
I generally agree with you, Kevin. I think it is interesting, though, to think about cases where maybe science does provide some clarity as to what the morality of a situation is. So, of course, we've been talking about the case of abortion and whether it's a human life. And, you can say, oh, it has cells. And so maybe you can make an actual kind of scientific argument that it has value as a human life. Another thing I was thinking of is like basically the case with psychology and how we've come to a better understanding of psychology. And I think a lot of things that we used to ascribe to just like, oh, she's possessed by a demon or something.
Yep.
It's actually probably some kind of like imbalance of chemicals. And there's a scientific explanation for that. And you can't just be like, oh, I'm just going to keep praying over things and then it'll get better. There's actually like, I don't know, there's some type of explanation for that. So I think that's another case where I see like science actually does provide some type of clarity into our faith.
So I want to comment on that because that's totally true and you're definitely right. But I was actually going to say a similar thing. And I think there's a balance there. So I was actually going to bring up pornography and I was going to talk about like porn is a sin and porn creates wounds, spiritual wounds, whatever. But also there's like a chemical reaction at play there that makes the temptation greater or makes the sin more potent, or you know what I mean? So I think like consistent with your point, Ephrem, our bodies scientifically respond to spiritual realities. But on the flip side of that, I also think we have to be cognizant of the fact that not everything can be explained with science, or like even further, not everything starts with science. So like I've talked about Father Chad Ripperger before. Father Chad is an exorcist from the Omaha diocese. Are you laughing because I bring this up so much? Father Chad talks about like demonic influence and some of these other things. And I'm about to get a message. Should I just wait? And he talks about demonic influence, and everything you're saying, Ephrem, is true, that like there's like a psychological implication there when people are being influenced by demons or something like that. Yes, like psychological drugs, etc., can you be used to treat these things, but that doesn't mean there isn't a spiritual reality at play, and it's both, and it's not one or the other.
Sure. So Mary Kate, the biggest thing right now, and like, so as the Exorcist, when they come to Mundline a couple of times, I think they talk about how like the vast majority of the calls and cases that they get are psychological issues. Like,
I believe that.
But like Ephrem brings up a really good point. Like, so one of the things that I have found particularly fascinating and really hard to understand is, so when we talk about mortal sin, one of the requirements for mortal sin is the ability to have freedom. And so when you get into the realm of mental health, being able to judge if someone had, or even being able to judge yourself if you had full freedom to commit like certain acts, like that gets into a scientific realm. There is so much that like we are only kind of really starting to scrape the surface on and stuff like that. So like when you get into stuff like addictions and stuff, and like that science informs our like theological understandings a ton, and the way that we practice our faith. Like when it gets into things like scrupulosity and, you know, and like I said, full freedom and being able to, you know, to do certain things. Yeah, like that is that, because back then we didn't know that. It was immediately spiritualized, and it's not because we didn't care about science, because we didn't have anything. We just didn't know. And so like that's one of the ways, I guess, as Kevin was kind of saying earlier, like that science can help inform the way that we practice our faith and understand, again, like kind of like understand ourselves. So, yeah, we could do a whole podcast on mental health. I mean, I think that'd be really cool, but I think scientifically speaking, that's pretty relevant.
For sure. So is there anything in particular that you guys like, I guess we've kind of touched on some of this, but like, is there a scientific theory that you find particularly
Dubstep.
that is like more supportive of? You guys hear me? Am I frozen?
You were
back.
You were getting a little
You're back.
Dubstep, Mary Kate.
Did you hear my?
I think
did
your
you
question,
hear my question?
It was, are there any like scientific theories that like kind of help support our belief in certain ways? Maybe.
Yeah.
I know for me, there was one that happened this year. Our second year at seminary, me and Dan took an awesome class. Our rector, Father Karchi, he has a PhD in astrophysics from the University of Chicago. Brilliant man. He did a lot of work in physics before he's now a priest, obviously, and is the rector of the seminary. He's very smart. But he does a class on faith and science, and it is probably one of the best classes I've ever taken ever in my entire life. It was just absolutely fascinating, and his big thing is applying scientific principles and processes to our faith life. So like when you're in prayer, you can use the scientific method or scientific findings or scientific ways to actually enhance your prayer life and encounter God and test out different things. It's fascinating. He's got an awesome talk about that. If anybody, I can put it in the show notes or the chat if people are interested. It's really good. Anyway, he was one of the things we went into in that class was about the how electrons work, and like you can't like pinpoint them. Like it's all probabilities of like where they're going to be, and we were learning about like how God works with time this year, and I just made this connection of, well, like the way that electrons work and the way that I'm being told like here's how God works in time, or how God is like this eternal now, and like he's present to all our future possibilities, but like we like man, you're like I said, I'm like, it's like every time we do something, we're like collapsing the wave function in God's eternal now. I know it sounds a bizarre statement for if you're not familiar with the language, but like it was just this connection of like, wow, this is actually like this scientific principle that I didn't like, doesn't necessarily belong in the world of theology and faith. You make this connection, actually enhance my understanding of God or my understanding of faith. So I don't know if that was coherent at all, but that's a connection that one of those things where it's like, yes, it's like the science is actually, it's pushing my faith. It's expanding the way that I am seeing and understanding God.
Yeah. One of the things, Kevin, that I found in that class particularly is like a greater acceptance of being curious about God. I mean, it's one thing to be kind of like, okay, God, like, why does, I don't know, why does the church teach that? Right? It's probably a more common question. Just like being able to look at scripture, being able to look at the things we understand scientifically and being like, what does that have to do with you, Lord? Like, why did you make it that way? Like, just like, it being okay to be curious about like the really cool things that we learn in the scientific world. That has allowed me to be far more curious in my prayer. Like as things comes up, I'm just kind of like, whoa, like, like what's going on? Or like, okay, I can relate it back to that, or like that thing that happened today. So like, what's going on there? It's really cool that like God himself like wants us to be like curious about like the world that we live in, and even just like and him and stuff like that. So,
and he's really big on Father Cartu is very big on like there are like, so there's givens in science, right? There's, we can take gravity as a given, or F equals ma. These are like things we experience, and these are given. So like we can move forward in science knowing these things have to be true. Knowing that gravity is always going to be going down at minus, at 9.81 meters per second squared. Did I get that right?
I think so, yeah.
Anyway, like, so a given in religion and faith would be God is love. That's a given. So like all the things that happen to you in your life, you can work in like, that God is love, and that will always be the case. It can't change. And so you are working with all those things. So like, even like, it helps in like the question of evil. Well, God is love, but like this bad thing just happened. Or that God is a triune God, and Father, Son, Holy Spirit. There's a given, and there's a relationship there. So like it's not just like going forward. That's what Dan's saying is like you can be curious in these things with these givens, with these things are true, and now I'm gonna like work the things around it the way a scientist would in the lab. Like I know these things have to be the case, and so like here's the things that are changing, and how can I explain them? How can I work them into my greater worldview? So it was a really cool class. Go to seminary and you can take the class.
There it is.
Sorry, except for you, Mary Kate. Sorry.
There it is.
I was actually going to make that joke. I was going to say, well, you know what? I can't go to seminary. So.
Well, me and Dan.
That's why I'm on the AWC.
Inside jokes.
Just kidding.
That was everybody.
It was a joke. That was 150% a joke. Anyway, I hope nobody actually watches this. Okay. Anyway, cool. So does anyone have any follow-up on that? Because I have another question I wanted to ask. Are there any questions in the chat? It's 9:30. I feel like we should.
There are a couple, I think.
There's a couple, but if you have one more, if you have one more.
I have a good, Kev, you posed this question, which I think is a great question. And like, Dan, you kind of started to touch on this, but how can science impact the way that we live spiritually and pray? How can we apply scientific methods to personal contemplation? Personal contemplative prayer and the experience of spiritual direction. You guys kind of touched on this, like asking scientific questions and some of these other things, but is there anybody who does any of you guys want to go a little deeper on that? How can this like really affect our ability to pray and also just like contemplate, spiritual realities? Go ahead, Kev.
Well, yeah. I mean, for me, I would just reiterate what I just said of like the givens and the boundary conditions, and like that there's scientific method can be used to pray and like those things. And it's something that it's one of those things that if that's not how you see the world, then don't use it. I mean, the beauty of prayer is that it's pretty malleable, and it's just like how you talk with God. So that's, and the other thing would be like, just again, I think that Dan was kind of getting this in his question before of like, when have you seen God's majesty, or seen a scientific thing and be like, oh, that's definitely God. I mean, it's I saw this, and it's explained physically, and points to something spiritual, I think that's a thing that I try to do. I don't do it all the time, but I'll stop
I
talking.
think something like an examination of conscience is very scientific. Obviously, it's like, depending on how you do it, it's very methodical. You know, you're going over the same sorts of questions every night. You're thinking about things from a standard point of view in comparison. Particularly if you're discerning, you know, is this, you know, these types of things, these types of thoughts are from the Holy Spirit, or if they from the evil one.
Yeah.
That can be very scientific in our, you know, our methodology for going through that. Yeah, it's my thought.
Yeah, I guess along those lines, I think about like, you know, discernment of the passions and like, yeah, just recognizing like particular inclinations that we have and like asking those more scientific questions. Yeah, I guess I'm just commenting on what you said, Marty. I agree. Good.
It's like discernment of spirits. It's like the way you discern things with a scientific method. It's kind of like, I don't know, I feel like a lot of the same principles apply. And it just helps to have kind of those like guidelines as you're praying and try to figure out what life is all about.
Yeah. Wow, guys. No
Well
other
done.
comments about that? Good job. Did we just beat science? What was I going to try to say? I don't even know. I don't even know what that phrase means.
Beat it dead.
We just scienced so hard. There's literally nothing left to science. Okay.
In the world at all.
wanna go to the chat?
We have discovered everything there is to know about
We've made
science.
every scientific discovery now. So what are we gaining by like trying to fight this tension between science and faith? Like, what is there to be gained in having this conversation?
A holistic worldview.
That is a great way to say that.
I think that, and also just knowing how to.
Oh, Ephrem.
I think just knowing how, like, where certain people are coming from, like new atheists, there's just so many scientific arguments made. And if you're to ever give an account of your faith to anybody, and I think even just come to a deeper understanding of it yourself, I think you have to be able to understand some of those objections to the faith, and know what the church's response is. I think, you know, not only can you defend your faith in front of other people, but you'll have a deeper understanding of it yourself and have a holistic worldview, as Dan says.
Yeah, I guess to just elaborate on that a little bit, I think that obviously a lot of what we talk about that gets me fired up within this context is like the political aspect of some of these things and like what the political, I guess, ramifications of some of these things. And I think that when we are able to talk about faith and science within this context, that like the two fit together as opposed to one or the other, it almost like depoliticizes things because it like places them within a context of truth and reality that is totally, politics sort of become like neither here nor there. Like they're just like another, I don't know. They're just like, it's kind of irrelevant at that point, you know, like,
Hopefully. Yeah.
Well, hopefully. Yeah. Well, maybe, or perhaps not hopefully, but I think like the reality is that like, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, the only ones who like really have it right in terms of like full, cohesion,
A holistic
worldview
yes.
are the Catholics, which is crazy. But anyway, so
specifically the Catholic Church, not Catholics.
the Catholic Church.
Can you be Catholic and a member of the Flat Earth Society?
I believe yes.
As long
as you're not
believe.
As long as you're not holding, as long as you're, if the Flat Earth Society is compromising any of the beliefs, the truth and doctrine of the Catholic Church, then I would say that you are more than welcome to believe that the earth is flat and still be a Catholic in good standing, yes.
There's something inconsistent there, aside from the inconsistency of thinking
We're
that the
right
earth
back
is
where
flat.
we started, folks. Stay tuned. We're here
That's
for another
actually-
2 hours.
Now, Mary Kate,
How do
I
you
think
know what I'm going to say before I say it? I was actually basically just going to repeat the statement that I made in the beginning of like, the thing I always go back to is like, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So like, if you are willing to like, if you're willfully believing stuff that like, you just have to do some research to find out that that's not true. Like, there's a disconnect there. Like, I don't think.
Jesus didn't say, I'm the way and the truth and the life, do some research. It was, I'm the way and the truth and the life, follow me.
Well,
I mean, I guess I'm not.
Okay, but also like, I believe, tell me if someone thinks I'm wrong. I believe that if you're like wholeheartedly following Christ, you will, without even trying a lot of the time, stumble upon the truth about these things because that's where God leads us. He leads us to the truth. So like, again, it goes back to the reality that like the two, like you can't have one without the other. You can't have Christ and live a life of like total inconsistency with truth. And the same, like you can't have the full truth without also living in Christ. So if you're pursuing Christ, you will stumble upon a lot of truths. And I think that science, like, I wish, like, I honestly think about this sometimes, like it would be so cool to be a scientist, like really in it, because imagine the type of discoveries that you could make if you were also like, that was your day job, but you were also like praying about the science you were doing. Wouldn't that be so cool?
I should have brought my brother on this podcast.
Dang, you should have. Well, if
Sorry.
you had been reading our text this morning, but
Come on, Dan.
I love how this is making its way into the podcast.
Irresponsible.
This is why.
I think you bring up a good point, Mary Kate. Like, and maybe that's one of the points of these conversations is like, you know, if any of us are in the science world, or you know, let's expand it. Maybe you're in the political science world, or you're in the philosophy
political science. The only real science is political science.
The true oxymoron.
How do you
right
analyze
there.
voter data? That's what political science is.
Okay. But no, I think that gives us an added responsibility, right, as Catholics, to as we're doing our research, as we're discovering scientific truth, to absolutely be praying about it and to bring God into all of that and to not separate the two.
Amen.
I mean, so Mary Kate, if you found out that like St. Francis of Assisi was a flat earther, like would that somehow taint like his?
No, because there was
sainthood?
less. No, because you know what? St. Francis didn't have the resources at his fingertips to do the research. So I don't really think research is a bad thing. Like research is like, here's the thing. We're living in some seriously, we have a great responsibility as modern day Catholics because there's a great temptation to make science God and to lift science up as the epitome of truth without consulting faith. But on the flip side of that, we have a responsibility to actually do the research on things because we have the ability and that if information is available to us. And that's one of my biggest complaints about everything is that nobody does their research. Nobody does their research. Everybody's just like, well, you know, CNN said this about that today. And so I'm just going to believe
or
that.
Fox News.
OAN.
I think we're at the end of our rope with this conversation, everybody.
Are we? I feel like we were just getting somewhere.
Well,
all right. Well, are there any questions in the chat?
Well, I guess to that like point of like science and maybe my brain. John asked, John Trainer, usual member of this glorious conversation, currently saving lives. He asked, do Catholics seeking to reconcile faith and science too eagerly lose sight of the mystical realities of Catholicism?
I don't think so. I think if you're really doing the work to reconcile the two as opposed to putting too much emphasis, I don't know how you could put too much emphasis on well, maybe you could put too much emphasis on faith.
No.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
No, I mean, he's saying that like putting too much emphasis
on science. Yeah, that you're not.
Yeah.
Like, I'm trying to make it to work so hand in hand that I'm like trying to explain everything, or I'm losing some of the. And like I said, like St. Francis did not have the resources we had scientifically, but I mean, he was levitating and, you know, getting stigmata and seeing visions of heaven and things like that. So, I mean, I definitely don't think that like if you do too much science, that you're gonna like somehow lose your ability to have some sort of mystical prayer experience. Is a chance you could enhance it in some way. I don't know. There's something to this, and I think that's what my point I made like right at the beginning of like we're always so like eager to like make sure that like no faith and science work together. Don't worry. Like they're really trying to convince the people so much that like sometimes just like yeah, science is a way to get to truth. Faith is a way to get to truth. They're both ways to get to truth, and you know, use them where they each apply, and you're probably going to end up in the right place eventually if you use the tools in the way that they're meant to be used.
There are certain supernatural miracles, elements of faith that cannot be scientifically explained, that they just can't. There's no explanation. There will never be an explanation, and it's impossible for us to prove, or or they completely contradict everything that we know or believe from a science standpoint. And that those are things that we need to accept, and that can be I don't know, barrier is the right word, but that can provide a difficult, when we're trying to convince or deal with, or debate with science people or atheists or whatever. So I think there is a little. I do think John's question is a good one. I think there can be a little bit of a concern in that regard, as long as we acknowledge, there are some things that cannot be explained. There are some supernatural things that transcend science, but then there's other aspects where faith and science go hand to hand. And yeah, I think the two separate lanes, Kevin, as you said, is a good way to think about it.
Yeah, and I don't want to you don't want to be stick in your lane.
Sure.
There's a lot of crossover, and it just and it's honestly it's trying to over explain things is a problem in the spiritual life that I know I suffer from quite severely, of like trying to get the answers to everything, or like making sure like this is actually it, or this is the reason this happened. Instead of just like kind of like sitting with it sometimes and like, well, here's the truth, and this is what it is, and or just being with another person, or being with with God and prayer, and just like that's it, and not trying to explain or analyze everything to death.
And that's a good part of faith. Some things can't be explained. We just got to accept that we can't. We also have to accept that we're not always going to know all the answers. I think that's.
But we can know truth. Like it's we know truth. We're not saying that it's like less truth.
Yes, we can know truth, but we can't always explain how or why that is the truth. Yes. And if we accept that, it'll make our lives more peaceful. And I think.
Well, I do think there are some truths outside of our ability to know for certain.
Oh, definitely. How the Trinity works.
Yeah.
But I guess that kind of goes into what I'm saying. Like that kind of goes into what I'm saying though, is like, we know that the Trinity, we know that there's a triune God.
Yes.
The particulars, and how and why, like this science would always be, I'm not saying we shouldn't always learn more, and that's theology and it's discovering, and that's how eventually dogma is, discerned after hundreds of years of doctrine that's developed further and further. But there are sometimes, truths that, at least as of now, we can't fully understand. And I think if we try too hard to put like, to think about from a scientific perspective of I need to know exactly why this is, that's when we hurt our faith. I don't know if that makes sense. Ray Kate's looking at me like that doesn't make sense.
No, I'm sorry. I was listening to you and it did make sense. Derek just had like a good comment. So that I was gonna say, but we kind of touched on it earlier.
Any questions in there?
I just think Derek's comment is good. He was going to ask if we got around to discussing either Eucharistic miracles or the Shroud of Turin. Science can help us to understand that some things have no natural explanation, as weird as that sounds. So we did kind of touch on that earlier. The one I think of in particular, I don't know the details of the Shroud of Turin, obviously Eucharistic miracles, but the other one is Our Lady of Guadalupe. Like there have been scientific testing done on the Juan Diego's cloak that like pretty much confirms that it has no scientific explanation, which again, I think we did mention that earlier, and it just points back to the fact that like miracles are scientifically unexplainable, which is exactly what makes them miracles.
Nice.
One final question. I think we talked about this too. David Ellett asked this though. What are our thoughts on how the church should take science into account in social teaching? And he mentioned Laudato Si. Specifically,
so can you be more specific about that, because I'm not really sure what that means.
Science
within the context of Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, that's how he worded it. I guess I don't know, David, if you're still there, if you want to.
Well, I mean, so Laudato's, I mean, the idea that there's scientific evidence that there's global warming and that human beings have some sort of impact on that thing, and that there's an encyclical written on care for our common earth. Now, it wasn't just on global warming; it was on social systems. I mean, it gets reduced to that because we love reducing things to things, to
relieving tensions.
Yes, and we become heretical. But it's I think it's the idea of can science go and inform, like, I mean, the science says the earth is heating up. The science says that human beings probably have some part to play in that. And that is dictating some sort of social teaching of the church, saying, I'd say dictating, it is more informing of like, well, we really should do something that the church has always said we should not treat the earth like it's a disposable resource, and that, subdue the earth and master it was not like a treat the earth like it's a piece of garbage for our use and consumption. And that it did inform that. Now, I think it informed it in the sense of, like, I think Pope Francis's bigger teaching in Laudato Si is the dangers of greed and consumption, yes, and unchecked capitalism and or other political systems that are, cause that kind of like, just unchecked consumption. So anyway, I would say that yes, that truth can inform greater truths. Like, I think there's no problem in the sense of it can inform some sort of social teaching. Now, it can't, it can like back up a dogma, but it can't define a dogma. That it can't like lead to a new dogma. If that makes sense. Like we talked about before.
Comment of the night. Dan, it's
definitely Allie Katz.
Did you say it, Kevin? Who
No.
said it in the chat?
Oh, Dan said it in the chat. So, but no, Allie Katz saying, St. Francis of Assisi saying, make me a channel of your research.
Allie.
Oh, Allie.
Allie, that was really good.
Yeah. That's
I think Anthony Cusmano won comment of the night.
I don't know if I've seen him comment maybe one or two times. I know he watched.
Oh, okay.
He texted me the other night.
He does watch.
And so, Anthony, if you're out there and you're holding back jokes, that is selfish. And
it's a selfish decision, Anthony. It's
yes,
a business decision that's selfish.
You owe the world your jokes.
But in the meantime, Allie, you
Yeah,
are
what now?
the Kevin O'Malley comment winner of the evening. We need I feel like we need to give something to these people.
A round of applause.
What is Dan doing? Why are you doing that? What's happening? A round of applause, Sam. You're right. We can give Allie a round of applause. Oh, the claps. There we go, Kev. That's what I was looking for. Some of the claps.
But they can't see that.
I saw the clap, but I don't know how to do that.
Does anyone have
there.
any last minute thoughts? Anything else about science you want to share?
Science rules.
Yeah, Bill Nye.
Bill
Bill
Nye,
Nye,
the
the science guy, is the opposite of Catholic teaching. So
Kind of sucks because he was the best thing.
It doesn't mean that his videos weren't the best. When Bill Nye came on in Science Class, you're like, yeah, everyone cheered.
I loved him so much. I swear I had every episode memorized.
Mm-hmm.
When then the teacher rolled out the cart with the just very big TV, not big size screen, but just very deep TV.
It was.
You knew it was coming.
Strapped on with bungee cords.
VHS baby. These kids these days with their DVDs.
We can't hear you, Dan. I don't know if you've been talking this whole time. We can't hear you.
He's doing it on purpose, Kevin.
No,
he
he's
knows.
not.
Yes, he is. He's doing it on purpose.
No, he's not.
Yes, he is.
If he is, it's really impressive that he can make.
I literally have been saying for Dan, are you being serious? You weren't kidding. I literally said 5 minutes
Can you
ago.
hear me?
There
what
we
is Dan
go.
doing?
Oh yeah, no, I legitimately.
Now we can hear you.
I know because I wasn't muted. I didn't know what was going on.
You
Mary
really
Kate's like,
weren't
of
doing it on
course he
purpose."
was doing that. I'm like,
I seriously.
you can hear what I'm saying over here.
That was happening for at least 6 minutes. I
Was it
seriously
really?
thought you were just trolling us. Yeah, that's why I said, "What is Dan doing?" Because you were just talking, but
'cause I'm
nothing was
like-
happening.
Oh wow.
Dan, what'd you say? What were your words?
I don't know.
Nobody else
Was it about
figured
Bill
that
Nye?
out.
No, I was saying it was either Bill Nye that came on the TV or it was Magic School Bus. Both of those
Yeah,
are
Miss
very
Frizzle.
science based, or real world science. If you guys ever heard that one, that was pretty cool too.
Now, Dan, there are usually these things called VHSs and TVs on cards that had backs on them.
I
know
used to watch them.
No, you're too young.
Now I know back in World War II, Kevin. I don't know if you guys had that, but you know.
No, we didn't.
Kev.
We had science explained to us on the old radio.
All right. I have a prayer that we can close out with.
Nice.
Let's do it.
I can't
It
believe
is-
you weren't kidding. I seriously thought you were joking the whole time.
I hope you feel bad, Mary Kate.
I feel
All
a
right.
little bad. I think it's funny though. All right, pray.
This is a prayer. This is a prayer to Saint Albert, who is the patron saint of scientists.
Albert.
In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear scientist and doctor of the church, Saint Albert the Great, natural science always led you to the higher science of God. We pray that with greater knowledge, we may never be made proud, but we may always regard knowledge as a gift of God and a gift to understand both you and ourselves better. Inspire scientists to use their gifts well in studying the wonders of creation and thus bettering the whole of humanity to render greater glory to God. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
Poor Saint
Amen.
Albert. His greatest
Pray for us.
achievement was for someone he taught.
The
Having the
chapel-
name of Albert's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's true.
the chapel in my dorm room in
he's
college
great.
was St. Albert the Great Chapel.
Yeah, Saint Albert the Great.
Oh, there you go.
If you have-
All right.
And actually, really quick story before we go. My dorm was named after a priest who was a big time scientist who went with Teddy Roosevelt on an Amazon expedition to go
Oh,
exploring, and so yeah, pretty exciting.
That Notre Dame is quite a school,
crazy.
Quite a
Tremendous.
school.
quite a university.
Oh, it didn't work. Okay. I was trying to shoot a rubber band at the camera. Time for me to go to sleep.
Well, guys, it's been real.
I'm good.
Really?
Thanks, Ephrem and Sam for
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah,
guys.
coming
We
in. You are
totally
always
just
welcome.
blew past introducing you. By the way, if anyone's wondering, Ephrem, Sam,
Yeah,
they're
I'm Sam.
usually
Follow
well,
me
Sam's
on
usually in
Insta.
the chat. Ephrem is sometimes in the chat.
I'm
He's a-
normally
he's a-
the I'm
he's a
normally the
lurker.
comment of the week winner. So
Ooh,
Allie, you're welcome for this week.
that's the hope, is that if you win comment of the week, eventually
you get asked to.
Kevin O'Malley has a standing invite
That's
as the Kevin O'Malley.
Yeah.
He does.
The title
He has a
holder.
standing invite.
And also,
All
he's
right,
an awesome
guys.
person. But
It's exactly 10 o'clock. Let's
See ya.
roll out. Peace.
I think Dan wants to go to bed.
Bye.
Thanks, Ephrem. Thanks, Sam.